Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of organizational leadership and decision making. Glad to have you back. Moving on. Our agenda today, we'll first start off by going over the assignments, much as we do every week, and then we'll talk a bit about the reading that you're to read this week. Jumping straight into the assignments. This week, we focus on innovation principles. So by the end of the week, you should be able to define the TAM methodology and gain a better understanding of what role technological leadership plays in transformation and innovation. So for week 4's written assignment, you're to read an article and then discuss basically what the technology acceptance model is. So come up with a definition, make sure that's very clear, and then note how TAM is impacting educational settings, so how it has something to do with an environment such as this, and then give an overview of the case study and discuss the presentation of their findings. So what did they figure out? What was the point is basically what that's about. Remember that this should be 3 to 5 pages in length. It should be an APA format. It should have at least or the citation in appropriate format, and make sure that you don't do anything that would endanger you in the realm of plagiarism. A bit of foreshadowing of next week. And next week, you're going to read chapters 3 and 4 in Bratton, and we're going to talk a bit about power in leadership, and we'll talk about some interesting topics like bullying and what that does to productivity, and also how an organization's culture has something to do with productivity as well. For your discussion board post in week 5, you'll talk a bit about what power has to do in leadership, similar to what we talked about before, and how it impacts the bullying within the organization and what that does to productivity. You'll talk a bit about what the culture within an organization is and what that might also do to productivity within the organization. And then how does the culture impact leadership? And can culture be seen as a constraint on leadership? So does a leader's choices has it impacted by the corporate culture in which they must lead? For this week's discussion of reading, we're actually going to skip ahead to next week's. So we'll start by moving into chapter 3 of Power and Leadership, is the title of the chapter. So jumping right in, the learning outcomes from this chapter is you should be able to recognize and explain the types of power within the leadership process. Also understand and explain the differences or the different perspectives on power. Not everybody thinks the same way about it. Some of us think about it differently than others. Describe the evolution of studies of power and leadership as a field of learning. So like many things, people have studied it and have formed opinions about it. And then understand and explain the concept of organizational politics, its relationship to power and leadership. And then lastly, identify contemporary challenges around power and leadership. What are the things that exist in today's world that make them challenging? So first, what is power? In order to talk about a thing, it's a good idea to attempt to define the thing. So the description on the screen is actually a pretty good one. Is generally defined as the capacity or the potential to influence others in relation to their beliefs, attitudes, or activities. Of those, their activities are probably the easiest thing to influence, right? Someone's beliefs or attitudes may be more challenging to change, but you can, to some extent, control what they do, especially within a business setting. Um, the next bit is a bit of a heavy read, right? So critical leadership scholars contend that orthodox leadership theories, trait, behavioral, contingency, charismatic, adhere to traditional hierarchical and bureaucratic control systems and take the asymmetric power relationship within the leader-follower didactic as natural and unproblematic. So basically what that's saying is that a lot of the basically traditional theory approaches see it as being okay that one party in the relationship exerts control over the other. And that's more a question of stating it rather than arguing it or discussing it. But it basically is implying that that's kind of the status quo, and maybe that's okay. So in the non-traditional approach to leadership, there's more of a sharing of power between the leader and followers. And however, the organizational scholars that are not so enamored with that concept basically argue that it's just kind of blurring the lines, right? And that the power relationship kind of continues in a more apolitical perspective, right? So it's more saying that it may not exactly be that way. So the reality, though, is that a good leader, typically, in my opinion, needs to show his team that he is leading or she is leading that where they're going is the right direction. It's that buy-in, and the team that has faith in their leader is much more likely to follow. So an authoritarian type approach doesn't necessarily work. A everybody vote on it and let's decide what we're going to do probably doesn't work either. So it's somewhere between the two, with the leader having the team's best interest at heart and aligning their interest with that of the organization. So moving on to kind of figuring out what power is, um, taking a look at Karl Marx, his opinion was, as on the screen, the making of history is made not just in relation to the physical world, but also through the struggles that some social groups engage against others in circumstances of domination. So very much about one group controlling another. He argued that class interest, capitalists versus workers, follows from the social relations concerning the ownership and control of the means of production, and their conflict and power is structured into organizational design. So, as you can tell, Karl Marx was a socialist. He felt that the people should be in control of the means of production, is what we're basically getting to. So it's definitely one view on power. Max Weber was another German philosopher that basically proposed some socialistic sort of ideas that became kind of the foundation of a lot of our Western society. Uh, Going through the key elements on this slide is that the the second point, much more so than the first, is the theory of legitimate domination through legally enacted policies and regulations, right? Found in most modern bureaucracies. And there's two basic elements to those. One is that the people that are being governed by that organization feels that it's a legitimate organization, so they have the right to control them. And then there's usually some sort of a bureaucracy, an administrative apparatus that is put into place to make those things happen. In say the Western cultures in the United States, we have laws governing our behaviors in lots of situations, including things like traffic laws. The administrative apparatus for enforcing that is a mixture of the police force and the courts that try the cases associated with the police, right? So if you're speeding, you're breaking one of the rules that was put in place. So your will, your the actions that you're wanting to do are being controlled by that legislation. But you agreed to it as a general rule, those of us that certainly are citizens of this country, by virtue of having been here and elected the officials that made those laws that put the police forces into place. So it's basically kind of outlining that concept that uh, basically domination by one group over another may not be an illegal activity, especially if we consent to it in the form of having created and accepting the legitimacy of the force that is being imposed upon us. This slide's pretty interesting in that it kind of explains how we came to have kind of two different concepts that are often commingled. One is true power or formal power or authority And then the other is more of the influence sort of power that often exists within an organization. In one situation, based upon a location in an organization, one individual can directly influence what another individual does within the context of the work setting. And the other influence is more about in an informal way, without necessarily having been told that this person is your boss. You might do what that person asks you to do or persuades you to do, either because it seems like it's aligned with what you want to do, or perhaps there's other reasons beyond that you're willing to go along with what they're saying, understanding that it's not necessarily somebody that you report into. So it's interesting to see how that study kind of came to be. In the study of power, sometimes the people studying it go into great detail as to the specific minutia associated with it. For example, here, this discussion of power over versus power to. The idea being that in some situations you can get an individual, one person can get another person to do something, so to do some act. Similarly, there's also this concept of the power over a person, meaning that they have influence over them and can actually then in turn get them to do something, so to take an action. So it's a bit theoretical and to some extent, but it does kind of distinguish between the ability of influence versus control or authority. So if a person has the ability to impact a person's employment, be it fire them, perhaps not get them a raise, or put them assign them duties that are unenjoyable, then that person clearly has more power over the second individual, right? So these are the concepts. It's about action versus the intrinsic sort of concept of power. Another take on power was both French and Raven. The ability of one individual to exert control over another in a social situation is what they're discussing, and in particular, the idea that utility, so something that exists in one situation, should have or will have usefulness in all situations. Um, it also talks about perfect knowledge on the part of those concerned, being able to judge correctly the utility of all resources in all situations. Again, pretty theoretical and maybe not all that accurate or applicable. To assume that one person can influence another person at all times is a bit far-fetched, right? Because things are very situational oftentimes. So the five kind of bases of power would be potentially referent, referent, expert, legitimate, reward, and coercive. And those are pretty interesting, and that may be a pretty good list if you think about it. Sometimes people were coercive in nature of getting you to do something through some means of manipulation. Sometimes they will reward you for doing so, either in a social sort of way, or perhaps more explicitly in the sense of some reward, of some tangible reward that you get. A legitimate person having control over you might control what you do as well. If there's somebody that you view as being an expert in a domain and they suggest that you do things a certain way because they're the expert, you might defer to their knowledge. So those are kind of the five bases. Um, Giddens also noted that all individuals may have power, but in organizational context, power is influenced and constrained by the distribution of different types of resources. So it's about allocative resources. So control over physical things such as monetary reward, and authoritarian resources such as management practices. Steve and Luke talked about power as a three-dimensional phenomena, so something made up of three things. One dimension of power focuses on the ability of an individual to enact commands in observable conflicts. So there's something where you can see two different ways or more of wanting to do something, and someone exerts control over it, and one of those things occurs. A two-dimensional view of power extends the analysis by examining the ability of the social actor to control the agenda, which is a source of power overlooked in the pluralist model. So controlling the things that are going to be done is a pretty important way of controlling the situation. The three-dimensional view is the social processes in which those with power induce the powerless to behave or believe as the former wishes without coercion. So they're able to do so without some sort of manipulation. And it's achieved by a complex infrastructure of persuasion or justification. So it could be as simple as building a well-structured logical argument. So for some different perspectives on power, one perspective is that power operates at all social institutions. It exudes from people that are powerful, and that people that follow others aren't victims, but rather they're parties to the behavior. Um, and it's associated oftentimes with a web of policies, practices, and procedures within an organization. Conceptualizing power as a relational activity rather than as a possession widens the focus of attention from who and the why to how of power. So HR policies and practices, for instance, are a good sort of discussion of that. Power also prevents some behaviors while at the same time positively encouraging others, both at the broadcast, political, and historical level, and at the deepest level of individual identity. Power constitutes what we know as a society, including, of course, how we think about work organizations, emphasizing that power and knowledge are closely interconnected, serving to reinforce one another. And power is all pervasive. Homogeny that acknowledges the complexity and mixture of consensus and conflict, and hence power relations in a broad sense. Um, so there's a group dominating over other groups and a group's leadership. It expresses the relationship of leaders and domination that produce a general sense of coordinated reality for most people. Besides that, it also represents an activity, social process in which alternative resistance against incorporation. No leader can guarantee that followers will follow, and any decision of or discussion of power and leadership has to acknowledge that leaders-follower relations are inevitably characterized by structured power, cooperation, and conflict. Comparing Weber's and Luke's concepts of power with the others, power is possessed by individuals, power is relational and pervasive. Power resides in social elites. Power is found um, um, in everyday social practice. Power dominates powerful, and resistance is futile. People build their own web of power. Resistance challenges elites. Power is negative and repressive. Power is creative and contributes to social order. So as you can see, there's lots of different opinions on what power is. But I think we can all agree that it is something that exists and is something worth discussing. Continuing that discussion, power is visible, uh, exercised when needed. Power is imperceivable through everyday routines. Knowledge of power sources is empowering. Knowledge buttresses the web of power. So again, lots of different opinions on it. Obedience is central to an analysis of the construction of power in leader-follow relationships. In organizational structure, coercive power commonly implies the ability of a leader to elicit or on subordinates feared penalties for disobedient behavior or control over subordinates. Crucially, it is the subordinate's dependency for coercion to be effective. So there can be bullying behaviors that undermine a subordinate's dignity and self-esteem. So we're getting into some of the more negative aspects of power. One common thread in all abusive relationships is the element of dependency. The abuser controls some important resource in the target's life. The target is dependent on the abuser. There are also research evidences that suggest that leader coercive behaviors and bullying behaviors occur in workspaces because of the inability of the victim to defend her or himself due to a power imbalance. It is the analysis of dependency, the process of social interaction, the minutiae of everyday work experiences, and often misogynistic norms that influence its conduct that provide a more cognizant understanding of leader coercive and bullying behaviors in organizations. As you can probably tell, bullying is not good, right? So we're trying to kind of drill into how does one lead without being a bully. A bit more on it. There also serves as a reminder that not all of leader-follower social interactions rest upon charismatic appeal or the ritual of deference or adultation. They also remind us that leaders perpetuate coercive bullying acts, and too often this is interpreted as representing a few bad apples. So again, bullying, not good. The effect of leader coercion behaviors and bullying on recipients can range from psychological stress-related symptoms to physical harm. Can also affect employees' loyalty, commitment, and performance, and organizational performance through an increase in absenteeism, high turnover, and cost of recruitment and training interventions, as well as loss of productivity. So the basic idea here is that if you have bullies in an organization, not surprisingly, people don't want to work for them. There's the distinction between influencing outcomes and leading versus bullying. Um, Gordon found that power leadership is generally debated in two perspectives. Traditionally, power is seen as a phenomenon within hierarchical structures and control systems of organizations. The second focus is on the role of dispersed leadership theories and their emphasis on the promotion of empowerment through the transfer of leadership responsibility to lower levels with post-bureaucratic organizations. So obviously two different ways that leadership and power can be discussed. The orthodox theories present leaders with dualistic positions of privilege within organizations considered to be superior through followers, either through natural ability or particular attributes. The historical nature of power is deemed to be natural and unproblematic, leading to limitations to reflect of surface level issues and occurrences. Power is assumed to be legitimate for leadership figures, but illegitimate for organizational followers or for trade unions challenging managerial prerogative. Dispersed leadership theories focus primarily on self-leadership and team-based leadership approaches. Self-leadership employees take responsibilities for their own work processes and direction. Team leadership centers around autonomous work teams, each of which has their own leader. And if you think about it in software development as an example, one of the differences that have emerged fairly recently is the emergence of the concept of Scrum and Agile development. One of the key things that is often overlooked in Scrum approaches is that the team decides how much the team can do. They negotiate, they play a form of poker with each other to determine what gets done, and the team agrees that they can do it. So there's buy-in. So it's very much that the team decides what they're going to do. In a lot of traditional organizations, the leader, the manager, or whoever they might be, decides what they think the team can do, and they enforce their will upon others. Oftentimes into negative results, because who would know better how much someone can get done than that person? The sharing of leadership responsibilities ensures that the emphasis is put on the process of leadership rather than the attributes or behaviors of the leader. However, this assumes that power must also be shared and that the process of sharing power will be unproblematic. Power is something that is embedded historically and socially in the natures around organizational actors. It is closely related to the concept of dependency and therefore persuades activity and impacts on attempts to disperse leadership. So Fleming and Spicer discussed distinctions in the literature between episodic theories of power, where power is being used, versus systematic forms of influence where power is concealed, basically through long-lasting organizational structures, such as like organizational structure and so on. So basically, they identified 4 sites of organizational power. There's in organizations, through organizations, over organizations, and against organizations. They also recognize there are roles of other types of authority within organizational leadership and how they interlink and overlap or contrast within. So there's another school of thought, which is that in bureaucratic organizations, they can be viewed as social tools and as an expression of rational thought and action. So any follower of a large organization will encounter a complex flow of power up and across organizational hierarchies. Power is part of the rules of the game that both enable and constrain social action in the workplace. And then the last bit, power is associated with practices and procedures, control of human capability, rather than a coordination of resource. And then lastly, discovered that for individuals to be manageable, they must be known, and to be known, they must be rendered visible. Thus, conceptualized human resource management is designed to close the gap between expectation of performance and what is realized. And with that, we conclude our discussion of power in the various forms. It's an interesting concept. If you take nothing else away from this, take away that being a bully is bad. Just because you have the ability to exert control over another doesn't mean that you should do so in a non-thoughtful way. You should take some time and make sure that what you're doing makes sense, that it is appropriate, that it is measured, and that it is aligned with the goals of the organization, not with your own personal goals. Nobody wants to work with a bully, and because people have choices in employment, they won't. They will move on to other companies, other organizations, and on their way out the door, they may very well say, you're the reason they are leaving. Whenever somebody leaves a company, it is a substantial cost event to the company. It takes considerable amounts of money to identify, recruit, and train individuals to work within an organization. Somebody within an organization that is causing the people to leave is not a good thing, and they will be identified and removed. So if nothing else, aside from it being a bad thing to do, it may very well affect your long-term livelihood. So manage people effectively, lead them, direct them, ideally influence rather than control them, and you'll receive typically better results long-term, both in terms of your relationships with them, obviously, but also within the organization's effectiveness and efficiencies and productivity. So with that, I wish you well. I will speak with you again next week.